man-eater of Yemmaydoddi. Yemmaydoddi is an area of forest in the Kadura district of Mysore in southern India. It is bordered by a ridge of foothills, the highest of which is named Hoggar Khan, that form the eastern spurs of the great mountain range known as the Baba Budans, which reach a height of 6,500 feet. A magnificent lake, called the Medak, entirely surrounded by forest-clad hills, forms the southern limit of this area, from which a narrow water channel, paralleled by an equally narrow forest road, runs for 10 miles northeastwards, till the former joins a smaller lake about 3 miles north of the little town of Birur. This area is rich in game, and still richer in vast herds of cattle that are driven into the forest by day to graze, and driven back each evening to Birur. Small wonder it is, then, that the surroundings abound with tiger, that come there in the first instance as game killers, to feed on the plentiful sambar, spotted deer and wild pig, but sooner or later become cattle lifters, because the cattle are so much easier to kill and because of the complete complacency and indifference with which the local herdsmen look after their charges. It is no exaggeration to say that hardly a day passes without the loss of a fine cow or bull in the jaws of a tiger, while the panther's destruction of calves, goats and village dogs on the outskirts of Birur is almost as common. Sketch map of localities referred to in the story of the man-eater of Yemmaydoddi. Actually, these smaller carnivores are fewer in number than their bigger cousins, and confine themselves to the outskirts of the town itself, well out of the tiger area, because of their fear of the larger animal to whom they themselves sometimes fall prey. Early in 1946 a small male tiger appeared in this locality with habits distinctly its own. It began with minor killings of calves and goats, snatched in the evenings from returning herds, near the outskirts of Birur, and its depredations were at first taken for those of a panther, except for the characteristic breaking of the neck in the case of the larger calves. This method of killing is almost exclusively followed by tiger, and sometimes by the larger species of forest panther, known as Thendu, in Hindustani, so that there was appreciable cause for mistake in identifying the marauder as one of the latter, till on one occasion a frightened herdsman actually witnessed the killing of a young cow, whereafter the question was no longer in doubt. This young animal rapidly grew to adulthood in the area, miraculously escaping the shots of various shikaris, both indigenous and foreign, and grew in cunning and daring too, till in 18 months it became a major menace to the cattle grazers, killing twice, and occasionally thrice a week, and invariably selecting a particularly fine specimen on each occasion. Towards the end of 1948, I accompanied a party of friends to Yemmaydoddi, with the object of procuring a trophy for one of them, Alfie Robertson, who was shortly due to return to England. I had received news of the tiger on several occasions and felt sure it would be a fairly easy matter for my companion to bag the animal, provided we camped at Birur a few days till receiving news of a kill. We motored from Bangalore, the distance being 134 miles. Unfortunately I was detained at my office and we left late in the evening. The roads were execrable, and we met with an accident near a place called Tipcha, 86 miles from Bangalore. We were using my friend's car and he was driving. The rear wheel went over a deceptively flat stone, which stood up on its edge when the wheel passed over one end of it, the other cutting a 9-inch slit in the petrol tank, which was at the rear of the car. 8 gallons of gasoline thereupon poured onto the road, and the vehicle came to a stop. We had no spare petrol, but were carrying a Primus stove, for which we had brought 2 bottles of paraffin oil. Passing one end of the rubber lead of the foot pump into a bottle of paraffin, we contrived to fit the remaining end onto the pipe leading into the carburetor after having first started a siphon feed. Thus we managed to cover the short remaining distance to Tipcha. Here we awoke the only tinker in town, unbuckled the fuel tank and managed to patch up the rent with the side of a paraffin tin which I found outside some sleeping inhabitant's house. Next came the major problem of fuel for the onward journey. We pushed the car to the one petrol station in the town, only to be informed that the supply of gas had been exhausted the previous day and would not be replenished till noon the next day, at the earliest. It seemed that we were doomed to a prolonged halt at Tipcha. There were 1 or 2 lorries in the town. We awoke the sleeping drivers and offered them fabulous prices for just 1 gallon of petrol to carry us the 16 miles to the next town of Ironkere, where was a Burma Shell petrol pump at which we were bound to be able to get a fresh supply. But one and all pleaded they themselves had run out of fuel, and were awaiting the expected fresh stock at noon next day. The situation was disheartening, till I decided on adopting desperate measures. It was about 3:30 a.m., and scruples and conscience, like the town of Tipcha, had long since fallen asleep. Calling to Alfie to bring the paraffin tin, from which we had cut the patch for our fuel tank, and carrying the rubber lead of the foot pump myself, we commenced a stealthy stalk through the silent streets of Tipcha. In a lane we spotted a battered A-model Ford. Instructing Alfie to keep careful watch against the owner awakening, I crept forward on the off side of the vehicle. Reaching the bonnet, I removed the fuel tank cover behind the engine, slipped one end of the rubber tube into the tank, and siphoned a little over a quart of the precious fuel into the tin, which I balanced between my knees. A second trip procured us another quart. Mixing the fuel with the remaining bottle of paraffin oil, we made off hastily to Ironkere, where we obtained a fresh supply. As a result, we did not arrive at our destination, the small town of Birur, until about 7:30 in the morning. We passed through the town and had gone about 2 miles towards the forest, when we came upon an open field in which a number of vultures were crowded. My friend took a photograph, while I got down to investigate the cause of this assembly, and was agreeably surprised to find a half-grown bullock, killed by a panther, right up against the hedge that bordered the road we had just traversed. There was no doubt that the kill had been made by a panther, as the fang marks on the throat of the dead animal showed where it had been strangled. The vertebrae of the neck were intact and had not been broken, which would have been the case had the killer been a tiger. Besides, the underportion of the animal had been eaten, while the entrails were still inside the carcasses, conclusively proving a panther to have been the miscreant. For a tiger is a clean feeder, and before beginning a meal makes an opening in the rear portion of its kill, through which it removes the entrails and stomach to a distance of 10 feet, so that its meal shall not be polluted with excreta. We were highly delighted at this early stroke of luck, and after protecting the kill from the vultures with branches broken at a distance from the hedge, I constructed a hide in the hedge itself, overlooking the kill at point-blank range. We made a good job of this construction, and Alfie felt himself more than compensated for the trouble we had experienced with his car the night before, in the certainty of bagging the panther when it returned to its kill late that evening. We then moved on some distance, ate, and slept in preparation for the night's adventure. By 5 p.m., we turned to the kill and our hideout, removing the covering which had effectively kept the vultures from the dead animal. Alfie then sat himself inside the hide, complete with rifle, torch, blanket and water bottle, and I was in the act of driving back to Birur in the car, when a breathless herdsman ran up to inform us that one of his large milch cows had just been killed by a tiger, hardly half an hour earlier and not a mile away. I gave the decision to Alfie. Would he prefer a panther as a certainty, or a tiger as a chance? In keeping with what would have been my own decision, he chose to make an attempt on the tiger. We accordingly bundled the paraphernalia out of the hide and into the car, drove swiftly up the road for half a mile till the herdsman told us to stop, brought the things out again, and then hastened after him into the forest and to the kill. We did not have far to walk, and within 3 furlongs came upon the dead animal, a fine black milking cow. The neck had been distinctly broken and bubbles of froth were still coming from the nose. But the tiger had not eaten a morsel, evidently having been disturbed by the herdsman, or perhaps by the buffaloes, which had been grazing along with the cattle. It was now 6 p.m. and rapidly growing dark. Unfortunately, there was no tree at this spot, and a few minutes' search made it evident we would either have to abandon the kill or risk a ground shot at the tiger when it returned. Alfie was too keen even to hear of abandoning the kill, so with the help of the herdsman I broke a few branches from adjoining bushes, and made a very rough hide, into which we all clambered shortly after 6:30 p.m. It was almost dark by now, and within 15 minutes the outline of the dead cow, 25 yards away, faded into obscurity. Although moonless, the stars diffused sufficient light to enable us to see in the immediate vicinity, but the kill itself was just out of range. An hour passed, and then about half a mile away I heard the weird cry of the solitary jackal. Much has been written and many theories propounded about this strange phenomenon of the forests, the lone jackal. Jackals usually wander in packs near the outskirts of towns and villages, the precincts of which they enter at night in search of offal. Their chorus cry, headed by a leader, is distinctive, familiar to the people of India, and sounds something like the lone jackal, however, although a jackal of the same species in every sense of the word, adopts a very different call. His solitary, long-drawn, had earned him a reputation, coupled with endless superstitions, fables and jungle lore. But from this maze of conjecture 2 theories stand out. The first is that this jackal accompanies a tiger or panther, generally the former, which it leads to a kill by its weird cry, claiming as its share of the strange partnership a bite at the remains after the rightful owner has gorged its fill. The second theory is that the lone jackal attaches itself to a particular carnivore, which it follows at a very safe distance, most tenaciously, in order to make certain of regular meals at what is left over from kills every time his patron feeds. Whichever of the 2 theories is correct, the presence and cry of a lone jackal is a certain indication of the proximity of a tiger or panther, a fact of which I have had personal corroboration in many forest areas of India. Therefore, the cry of the lone jackal told us that night, in as definite a way as if we had seen the tiger itself, that the cattle slayer was approaching. About 10 minutes elapsed and then we heard a distinct in the direction of, and beyond, the kill. The tiger had arrived. Softly I nudged Alfie's leg, but he was all attention. Time passed, and we heard a slight crackle in the scrub followed by a faint thud and dragging sound. Alfie depressed the torch switch and a bright beam of light flared out. Unfortunately, with the uncertain background, he misjudged the spot where the kill was lying, and shone a little too far to the left. The warning was enough for the tiger, and with a guttural, it sprang back into the shelter of the undergrowth. We remained an hour longer, but I knew it was time wasted, and that the tiger would not return. At the end of this time we heard a faint as the tiger crossed a ridge over a mile away, leaving us to ourselves. Ruefully we packed up and returned to the car, only to find that Alfie had mislaid the switch key. While searching, the night bus, carrying passengers from the town of Lingadhalli to Birur, passed us. Then Alfie found the key, and we followed in the wake of the bus. Arriving at the spot where we had constructed our hideout for the panther, we were surprised to see, reflected in the glow of the headlights of the bus before us, the eyes of the leopard which had now returned and was devouring its kill. At the same time the driver of the bus saw the eyes, and brought the ponderous vehicle to a halt with a screech of brakes, and a cloud of suffocating dust which enveloped us behind. Alfie and I got down, walked abreast of the bus and located the panther sneaking away half across the intervening field. He fired and the animal sprang into the air with a sharp and then streaked across the field like greased lightning. Too late we realized that we had done the wrong thing. Alfie should have got back again in our hideout and I should have driven away in the wake of the bus. The leopard would undoubtedly have returned to its kill within minutes of the departure of the 2 vehicles, and given Alfie an easy shot. As matters stood, I had not counseled correctly, and we had now a wounded leopard on our hands. But it was no use crying over spilt milk, so we returned to Birur, to spend the night at the traveller's bungalow. Next morning found us back at the spot, and after casting around I found a faint blood trail which began to make itself evident only at the extreme end of the field, increasing as we entered the dense undergrowth. Here we were confronted with a tough proposition. The leopard had evidently been hit in the flank, and it had taken time for the blood to flow down the animal's side and drip to the ground, which is why it only appeared as a blood trail at the end of the field. Thereafter it had dripped freely, while the animal had crawled into the densest undergrowth, consisting of lantana and, wait a bit, shrubs, where it was impossible to follow except on hands and knees. A time-worn wild pig trail led through this undergrowth, and the leopard had passed along it, as was evident by the copious blood trail he left. On hands and knees, and pushing my .405 Winchester before me as I progressed, I crawled in the wake of the wounded beast with Alfie bringing up the rear, as a safeguard against a flank attack, or one from behind. We had progressed about 75 yards in this fashion when, without warning, the leopard, which had been lying up at the next bend in the trail, saw fit to launch his attack. There was hardly room for a miss, and I hit him almost at muzzle length, the soft-nosed bullet smashing his skull and completely removing the rear segment of the brain pan. He died in front of me, the fluid from his brain oozing from his shattered skull. We remained at Birur a full 10 days, but in all this time only one further kill occurred, and that on the forenoon of the 7th day at a place 6 miles down the Yemmaydoddi channel. By the time that word of the incident was brought to us and we arrived at the spot, it was late evening and we found that vultures had completely demolished the kill, no precaution having been taken to hide it with leaves. A tree overlooked the remains at about 40 yards distance, and Alfie sat in a crotch till midnight, but the tiger did not put in an appearance. Thereafter nothing happened, as I have said, and on the morning of the 11th day we left for Bangalore. Time passed. Then one dark night along the road from Lingadhalli to Birur motored a quartet of car-shikaris, people who shoot from their car with the aid of spotlights, never so much as setting foot to the ground when passing through the forests. Of trekking, the science of big game shooting, and the beauties of the jungle and Mother Nature, they know nothing and care less. For them, the highest form of sport lies in casting intense beams of light from their sealed beam spotlights into the bordering forest and discharging a volley of rifle and gunshots at whatever eyes might catch and reflect the brilliance of their sealed beams. As to what animal they fire at, male, female or young, they do not care, for they are filled only with the lust to kill or wound. Needless to say, such activities are against all existing regulations, but they often take place nevertheless. And so it transpired that, when about 4 miles from Birur, they picked up the large fiery white eyes of a tiger as it crested a bank that bordered the road. 2 shots rang out and the tiger sprang away, its lower jaw smashed at the extremity by a rifle bullet, while the other shot had gone wide. Needless to say the car-shikaris did not stop to investigate, nor did they return next morning to trail the wounded beast and put it out of its misery. They merely went on their way, seeking for other eyes at which to fire. The wounded tiger must have suffered intense agony for the next 2 months, nor could it eat properly. Being unable to maintain a death grip on its prey with a badly healed broken lower jaw, it was unable to procure its usual food in the form of game or cattle. One day, about 3 months later, it attempted to secure a goat from a herd that had been driven to graze in the forest. With infinite caution it stalked the herd, and had just sprung upon a fat nanny, to kill her with a powerful blow from its paws, instead of the usual neck-breaking process with the jaw, when the audacious herdsman, standing close by, flung his staff. The chance aim proved true in this instance, and the staff caught the tiger a flanking blow. Enraged, it charged at the herdsman, the poor blow substitute again proving eminently successful in almost completely scalping the unfortunate man while still alive. His scream of terror and agony was cut short by another powerful blow of the forepaw, which this time crushed the man's skull as if it had been an egg. The man collapsed, leaving the tiger the choice of 2 victims to eat, the goat or a human being. It hesitated over the carcass of the latter, and licked the blood that oozed from the smashed skull. As if to make a fair comparison it then went across to the nanny, which it seized by the neck and after a moment began to carry away into the jungle thickets. But within a few paces, and for no accountable reason, it stopped, dropped the nanny, walked across to the dead herdsman, and seizing him by a shoulder, disappeared into the all-concealing fastnesses of the surrounding forest. The dreaded man-eater of Yemmaydoddi was thus created, and his reign of stark terror had commenced. Thereafter, deaths attributable to this beast occurred within an area of about 250 square miles, ranging from Birur, Lingadhalli and up to Bhagavadkatte on the north, across to Santaveri on the Baba Budan Mountains on the west, and southwards past the Ironkere Lake to Sakrepatna and back to Birur. While human kills followed each other with alarmingly increasing regularity, they were spaced along a definite beat and had the distinctive mark that every victim had been killed by a powerful blow of the paw and not die by usual fatal jaw grip. Further, the fact that the tiger was unable to use its lower jaw effectively was amply evident through examination of the various corpses, to none of which was it the man-eater's custom to return for a second meal. The flesh had been scraped from them in a peculiar way, obviously by the upper jaw working alone on the strips of human flesh which this animal would lay bare with its powerful claws to facilitate the difficult task of eating. With the advent of the man-eater, the activities of the erstwhile very energetic cattle-killing tiger which had been operating along the Yemmaydoddi and Lingadhalli routes, ceased abruptly, leaving room for the conclusion that it was this cattle lifter, and none other, that had now developed into a man-eater. The story of the Shikaris did not become known for some time, till one of them, in a 169 man-eaters and one rogue moment of boastful hilarity, revealed that they had fired at and wounded a tiger on the Birur-Lingadhalli road. A subsequent piecing together of these facts brought the story to light as we now know it. As I have said, the man-eater followed an almost well-defined beat, killing at the outskirts of villages and hamlets bordering the places I have named, and in regular succession. These facts I gathered upon reading the reports that appeared in the press regarding the beast's activities, and by marking off on my forest map the names of these places and the dates on which people had been killed. The center of this region, which the tiger had chosen as a regular beat, comprised the rocky and heavily forested slopes of the foothill range, topped by the hill called Bhagavadkatte, some 4,500 feet in height. I concluded that these fastnesses, almost without population, sheltered the tiger, that from them it made forays into the more populous areas in a series of almost regular calls. A study of the dates of past killings revealed that the animal almost regularly returned along its rounds every third or fourth month. The total number of killings had by this time reached 27. In making my attempt to shoot this animal, I decided to operate at the village of Lingadhalli, which lay almost midway between Birur and Lingadhalli, and was only 3.5 miles from the base of Mount Bhagavadkatte itself through downwardly sloping scrub jungle. I selected this area primarily because I was fairly well acquainted with the geography of the surrounding forest, and was fairly well known to the inhabitants, from whom I could expect reasonable cooperation. Further, the village of Lingadhalli was, as I have said, near to the foothills of Bhagavadkatte, where I was sure the tiger had its headquarters. Most important of all, this village had not escaped losing a life every time the tiger passed on his rounds. In other words, it was almost a certain call for him. I arrived at Lingadhalli a full fortnight before the close of the 3-month cycle, that is within 2 to 6 weeks of the next projected visit. Thus, I gave myself plenty of time to make inquiries into the details and nature of the various killings, and to arrive at a plan of circumventing this brute if possible. The village itself is fairly large and although not very heavily populated, contains houses of a permanent nature, constructed from stone of reddish hue which abounds in the vicinity, occurring in the form of flakes and varying in size from the palm of one's hand to an area of several square feet. Lingadhalli is also old. It dates from distant times and possesses 2 ancient and solidly built temples. It is bounded on the west, southwest and northwest by the dense scrub leading to Bhagavadkatte, and on the south by a large and beautiful lake that abounds with geese, wild duck and teal in the winter months, to the south of which a track leads to the Yemmaydoddi water channel about 3 miles away. To the southeast lies a belt of dense plantations of coconut and banana trees, interspersed with the tall slim stems of the areca nut, the whole being thickly matted below by growths of the betel vine, the leaves of which are liberally chewed by Indians throughout the peninsula. This area consists of very moist land, naturally low-lying and irrigated by a channel from the lake to the south of the village. Southward of Hogarhorley lie a few scattered rice fields, and then southeastwards and eastwards and northwards fields of dry crops, fed only by the monsoon rains, extending up to the Birur Lingadhalli road, about 1.5 miles away. As you may have guessed by now, the majority of kills occurred in the scrub belt to the west, southwest and northwest, while 2 had taken place in the heart of the coconut plantation itself, one of the victims being a cousin of the owner. The remaining and more open areas had been avoided by the man-eater. Furthermore, the kills had taken place in the late afternoon in the majority of cases, as the inhabitants had, since the killings commenced, cultivated the healthy habit of securing themselves indoors before sundown. The tiger's pug marks had shown, on several occasions, that he had entered the outskirts of the village in early morning, but that the stoutly built houses and solid wooden doors had prevented him, at least so far, from effecting any nocturnal entries. It was difficult to formulate a plan of action in these circumstances. I knew that once the tiger killed he would move on and not visit Hogarhorley again for another 3 or 4 months. At the same time, it was humanly impossible for me to anticipate where the next man would be attacked and killed. The only remaining and obvious line of action, therefore, was for me to attempt to attract the tiger to myself by acting as bait, a procedure which, you may be quite well assured, I felt most reluctant to follow. Nevertheless, it appeared to be the only way. Since my arrival at Hogarhorley a week had passed in obtaining all these details, studying the circumstances in which the various kills had taken place and visiting the spots where they had actually occurred. The time was now fast approaching when the man-eater's next visit fell due. I found that the victims in the scrub area to the west had been either woodcutters or herdsmen grazing cattle. Not one of the cattle had been harmed by the man-eater, although an occasional wandering panther had taken its toll. An idea then occurred to me which, I flattered myself, was quite ingenious. Selecting a tree about 1/2 mile inside this scrub, I arranged for a chair to be tied within its branches about 15 feet from the ground and out of range of the tiger's leap. I then procured a stout piece of wood, about 6 feet in length and 3 inches in diameter, one end of which I suspended from a branch by a stout cord while the other end rested, at an angle, against a branch of the tree below me. To this end I tied another piece of string, which I passed through a loop onto the front portion of my shoe. It was thus possible for me to remain comfortably seated in a chair, armed and prepared, while by merely moving my foot up and down on its heel, I would cause the piece of wood suspended below to strike against the branch it rested upon, emulating the sound made by a woodcutter, although, of course, considerably less in volume. When one foot became tired, I could change the string to the other foot. I even left this string long enough to operate by hand, when, by increasing the length of the pull, I could increase the swing of the wood and consequently the noise of the blows. Above my head, as shelter from the sun, I arranged a canopy of the leaves of the tree itself, without cutting them. It was also comforting to know that I could smoke, eat, drink, cough and move about in my chair without any need for cramped concealment. In fact, as I was acting as bait myself, the more I advertised my presence, the greater chance would there be of the tiger attempting to stalk or attack me. The patel or headman of Hogarhorley village, Yemmaydoddi, gave me his fullest cooperation. I explained my plan to him and stressed that from the time I started operating from my perch, it would be his business, at all costs, to see that nobody entered the scrub jungle, or the coconut plantation, thus ensuring that the tiger had no bait to attack but myself. This he promised to do, and forthwith broadcast to the village, and to the surrounding areas, under threat of dire consequences, that nobody was to be about after midday, especially in the direction of the scrub jungle and plantation. There was enough hay and dried grass around the village on which to feed the cattle for a fortnight to 3 weeks, by which time I hoped the tiger would have put in an appearance. The patel's instructions were all the more popular because nobody wished to die beneath the paws of the tiger, and because it provided the villagers with the attractive prospect of being completely idle for the next 3 weeks. Precisely on the 10th day after my arrival at Bhagavadkatte, I began to put my plan to the test. After an early lunch I arrived at the tree shortly before 9 a.m., armed with water bottle, sandwiches and pipe, and of course my .405, and my first day's vigil commenced. Moving my foot to create the tapping sound was, I soon discovered, a monotonous and tiring pastime, added to which the reflected rays of the noonday sun caused me great discomfort and proved extremely tiring to the eyes, gazing as I must, through the shimmering heat haze, at the scrub jungle around me. I remained on my perch till sundown and continued to do so for the next week, without hearing or seeing any indication of the tiger's return. By this time I had completely familiarized myself with the position of every large bush within my range of vision, and had mentally mapped out the various lines of approach, consistent with available cover, the tiger was likely to take in stalking me on my tree, that is, when and if he returned. After the first unproductive week, and to relieve the deadly monotony I had experienced, I purchased a couple of cheap novels from the small bookstall at Birur railway station, which I read while sitting on my perch, automatically operating the string that pulled the tapping wood, and relying on my hearing to tell me of anything that was happening while I read. Thus I reached the end of the second week, still without any indication of the tiger's return. It will be appreciated that by this time I was growing impatient. I was, in fact, very fed up with my forced inactivity. I racked my brains to think of some better plan but failed to arrive at any conclusion offering a more likely line of action than the one I was following. We were now in the 4th month, and the return of the tiger was due at any time, provided of course he was still following his beat. I had arranged with the Deputy Commissioner at Chikmagalur, the headquarters town of the district, to keep me posted of all human kills in the area through his subordinate, the Amilder at Kadur, which was only 4 miles from Birur. A runner was to be dispatched to me as soon as any news was received of a kill, and sure enough, 2 days later the runner arrived from the Amilder, telling me the tiger had killed at a hamlet on the Chikmagalur Sakrepatna road 4 days earlier. The very next day the runner came again, to inform me of the slaying of a cowherd on the northern shores of the Ironkere Lake. This was 5 miles from the Yemmaydoddi Lake, which in turn was about 9 miles from Bhagavadkatte. Reports so far had been satisfactory, inasmuch as they definitely indicated that the tiger was still following his regular beat and was only some 14 miles away at the time of the last killing, 2 days before the news had reached me. I could therefore expect that by this time the tiger was very near to the outskirts of Bhagavadkatte, if not already there, and as the morrow would make the 3rd day since he had eaten, there was every hope that he would be eagerly looking for a fresh victim. That evening I told Yemmaydoddi to warn the inhabitants of Bhagavadkatte and the neighborhood that the killer was in the vicinity, and to keep away from the scrub area and the plantation at all costs. The next morning found me seated in my accustomed place even earlier than usual. This time I had not brought a novel, but concentrated on banging the piece of wood as loudly as I could, coughing, and moving about on the branch of the tree so as to show myself as much as possible. In returning to the village that evening I took the greatest precautions against a surprise attack, but another 2 days passed and nothing happened. Nor did I receive any word regarding further kills. It now occurred to me that the tiger might have returned to his fastnesses in the Hogakan Ridge, or perhaps bypassed Bhagavadkatte and gone in a northwesterly direction to Lingadhalli and Bhagavadkatte, or even westwards to Santaveri. As the weather was comparatively warm and a half-moon had risen, I determined to spend the entire afternoons and nights of the next 2 days in the tree, in the hope that I might thus be afforded an opportunity of attracting the tiger, which undoubtedly would also be on the move after dark. This would place a still greater strain on me, tired out as I was with 15 days of fruitless sitting. Nevertheless, I determined to undertake the ordeal in a desperate attempt at success. The next forenoon found me back again, this time with a basket containing my dinner, a flask of hot tea, a blanket, water bottle, torch and other accoutrements that accompany the night watcher who spends long, cramped hours on a tree. I also brought 3 tablets of benzotrine to make sure that I did not fall asleep. I repeated the same ordeal of tapping all afternoon, and kept it up until late at night. The jungle was inordinately silent except for the call of a horned owl, and the faraway bark of a kaka or jungle sheep. The moon set by 1:30 a.m. and it became pitch dark and also very cold. Around 3 o'clock I felt sleepy and swallowed 2 out of the 3 tablets of benstrine. Half an hour later I heard a rustle, and then the excited cackle of a hyena as he winded or saw me. "What have we here?" he commented, and then slunk on his way in the darkness. Again silence and darkness, till the pale glow of the false dawn heralded 1 hour to sunrise. That hour passed, and then crowed the grey jungle cock, greeting the rising sun, as I dropped wearily from my perch, to struggle back to Bhagavadkatte and snatch 4 hours of sleep. 11 a.m. found me back again on the tree to continue the tiresome watch. I had come to the conclusion that I could not stand much more of it. The hot afternoon passed as usual, of a green barbet, and of the Indian quail, which is related to the cuckoo family, being the only sounds. Evening approached, and a spurfowl, picking among the dried leaves below a nearby bush, cried. There was the excited chatter of a group of birds colloquially known as the 7 Sisters as they prepared to roost for the night, and as the sun sank below the slopes of Bhagavadkatte, a peacock issued his farewell note. Then the birds of the night took up the cry. Chirped the nightjars, as they flitted overhead, to alter their call to when they perched on the ground or branches of trees nearby. 10 o'clock came, and, shortly afterwards, a series of calls from a herd of spotted deer in alarm. They repeated persistently, in warning. Undoubtedly a carnivore was on the move, and had been seen or winded by the watchful hinds, but whether a panther or ordinary tiger, or the man-eater itself, remained the question to be answered. I tapped louder and more vigorously with the wood, hoping the tiger would not ponder as to how this mysterious woodcutter came to be operating by night. The minutes dragged on, and then there came abruptly the strident belling cry of an alarmed sambar stag not half a mile away. He repeated, moving up towards Bhagavadkatte. Then deathly silence reigned again. Continuing the tapping, I scanned every bush that was visible in the half-moon, mentally revising the various lines of cover I anticipated the tiger might take in stalking the tree. Nothing moved along any of these, and all was still, except for one last, from the sambar, at a distance. The strange feeling that something would occur at any moment came over me, and I felt that I was being watched, yet not a sound or crackle disturbed the stillness. Tapping away, I coughed, then moved and finally stood up from my seat, coughing and spitting in true Indian fashion. Yet not a sound, and then, like a bolt from the blue, he came. He roared, and an enormous grey mass, as large as a Shetland pony on wings, appeared as if by magic from behind a bush barely 10 yards away, to charge at the trunk of the tree and reach the crotch below me. A great grey head appeared only 3 yards directly below me. I depressed the torch switch and fired between the glaring eyes. With the explosion of the rifle, the tiger fell backwards to earth, emitting an earth-shattering roar. I put in a second shot. He acknowledged this, too, with a further roar, and the next second he was gone. From the scrub 100 yards away I heard a last, and then complete silence. I knew that neither of my shots had missed, but cursed myself, nevertheless, at not having dropped the animal with, at least, my second shot. Nevertheless, I was certain it had been severely wounded and could not go very far. I allowed myself to doze for the rest of the night, and with the rising sun warily returned to Bhagavadkatte, to organize plans for following up the wounded beast. Mudligiri Goda rallied splendidly, and while I had a short rest, followed by hot tea, toast and bacon, arranged with the owner of a buffalo herd to drive his animals through the bush in the wake of the wounded tiger in the hope that it would be induced to reveal its whereabouts when the buffaloes came near. By 9 a.m., I was back at my tree, accompanied by Mudligiri, 2 scouts, 15 buffaloes and their owner. First I ascended to the top of the tree, and tried to locate the tiger, but nothing could be seen. At the foot of the tree, splashed against the bark, were flecks of blood from his face or head, as my first bullet hit him. Behind the bush, where he had retreated, we picked up a copious blood trail, showing my second shot had also taken effect. Thereafter we drove the buffaloes slowly in the direction the retreating tiger had taken, spreading them out as far as possible into a rough line. I followed the buffaloes, the 2 scouts keeping immediately behind me. Mudligiri and the owner of the buffaloes remained in the tree where I had sat. We had covered about 200 yards when we heard a deep growl. At the same time the line of buffaloes stopped, and lowered their heads, horns extended, in the direction from which the growl had come. A tree grew a little to my left, and I whispered to one of the scouts to climb it and see if he could locate the tiger. This he did, but signaled back to me that he could see nothing. The buffaloes had meantime backed from the spot, nor could we get them to go forward. Leaving him there, and the scout still up the tree he had ascended, the remaining scout and I tiptoed back to Mudligiri and instructed him to return to the village and try to collect some of the village dogs to help us. This he agreed to do, but it was a full hour and a half before he returned, accompanied by 2 mongrels only, saying that these were all he could succeed in collecting. We now set the dogs on the buffaloes to cause them to move forward, and so gained 25 yards, when the tiger set up a horrible growling. The buffaloes immediately came to a standstill, while the curs began yapping vociferously. Creeping forward for shelter behind the 2 foremost buffaloes, I endeavored to peer between their legs in an attempt to penetrate the undergrowth and catch a glimpse of the tiger, but could see nothing. I then attempted to prod the animals forward, but one of them turned on me suddenly, and I narrowly escaped the sweep of the long horns. My position was awkward in the extreme, with a wounded tiger before me that might charge at any moment, and nervous buffaloes around, that would defend themselves with their horns in a united stampede against the tiger, or myself, whichever provoked them first. Retreating a few steps, I signaled to the scout, who was still in the tree, to descend. With his and the other scouts' help, I then began throwing stones over the buffaloes into the undergrowth at the point from which the growls had come. This action was greeted with a fresh outburst of growling, but nothing we could do would induce the tiger to break cover and show himself. Nor would he retreat, and this fact indicated that he was in a bad condition. Further stoning proving useless, I withdrew the 2 scouts, leaving the buffaloes where they were, and with their help, and accompanied by the 2 curs, made a wide detour of the jungle, to come up at the rear of the tiger and about 300 yards beyond it. From here we advanced very slowly, the scouts under my instructions climbing every tree and point of vantage as we crept forward in an endeavor to see the tiger. Thus we covered some 200 yards, when one of the scouts signaled he could see something from the branch into which he had climbed. Descending, he whispered he had glimpsed a white and brown object beneath a bush about 50 yards away and roughly halfway to where the buffaloes were standing. Climbing into the branch with him, he indicated a clump of bushes, at which I first stared in vain before I saw an indistinct brown and white patch just beyond the clump. Aiming at this object, I fired, and the tiger, mistaking the direction of our approach, charged the buffaloes with a series of short roars. The nearest was taken by surprise as the tiger leapt on him. The remainder got together and rushed forward with lowered horns. Meanwhile, the buffalo which had been attacked bellowed with pain and fear and endeavored to shake his adversary off. The tiger remained perched on the buffalo, snarling and growling vociferously. From my point of vantage in the tree the scene was clear to me, but I dared not risk a shot for fear of killing the buffalo, or one of the herd that was fast approaching. And then the remaining buffaloes reached the spot and the scene became a medley of tossing horns and struggling brown bodies. Finding his position precarious, the tiger leapt off the buffalo he was straddling and rushed back back to cover, behind a bush only 25 yards away. I could clearly see him, crouched and watching the buffaloes. A single shot behind the left shoulder gave him his quietus. Later, on examining the tiger, I found that my first bullet of the night before had struck his right cheek, some 2 inches below and to the right of his eye, passing through his flesh and shattering his cheekbone. My second shot had cut through his belly, and in passing out had formed a gaping hole through which his entrails were trailing. My third and recent shot had penetrated his heart. The broken jaw, smashed by the car shikaris months ago, had healed badly, thus explaining why the animal had been unable to bite properly and had turned man-eater in consequence. The attacked buffalo had been badly mauled by the powerful claws, but not bitten. Compensation satisfied the owner. I am certain the animal recovered from the wound, as buffaloes are invariably much hardier than cattle and can survive severe physical injuries. Thus ended the career of the Yemmaydoddi man-eater, and while the district was well rid of a murderous and unrelenting killer, it must be remembered that the irresponsible and unsporting shot from the car shikaris was the root cause of all the trouble, and to their discredit must be laid the 29 innocent human lives that were lost. The end.